coming out tonight to the gods. We'd like him out to discuss what happens at 5 to 8. If Mike's in the middle of a slide, what we'll do is we'll just have a quick 5-minute break. If he's finished and ready to take questions, we'll still sort of give people a chance to go out and do the bookings for next week. For Wednesday. And it's a thing we have to think of and a golf plan. So I'm delighted to welcome you, Mike Morrison. Since Mike retired, he's become an authority on golfing history and been awarded the Murdoch Medal, which is awarded by the British Golf Collectors Society for a contribution to the heritage of golf. You've written, as far as I know, 3 books that you've written.
So far, I know.
All right, well, I was thinking The Origins of the Sacred Nine,
Yes.
for Royal Wellington, and then the Worst Golf Course Ever, for Cambridge University Golf Society, Links on the Hills,
Yes.
and this is the 4th.
This is number 4.
Brilliant, great. And so, as you can see, the Great English Golf Boom. There's one thing I'm certain of, which Wilma will be pleased about, which is I'm sure we're going to hear about the Scottish expatriate influence from reading the book. Yes, could do. It's one of those things we get in our household, the influence of the Scots. And I'm hopeful for us women here that we're going to get to hear about Isette Pearson, Lady Margaret Scott, and Cecil Leach.
Entirely possible.
Over to you.
Well, thank you. It was 8 years ago that, almost to the day, that I stood in this room nervously for the first time and spoke about golf history. Some of you may have been here, when I had figured out what I thought the old course looked like back in the day when it was first formed and how it had evolved over time. So it's quite nice to be back here doing a talk again on a slightly broader canvas. And I've given this talk a few times now. First in May at Hoylake, and then I gave it to the senior management team of England Golf at Woodhall in June, and then at St Andrews during Open Week. I was invited to a Meet the Author event. And last weekend I was at Edgbaston Golf Club, also every so it's not quite a rock tour in stadiums, but you know, it's developing. It's developing. So, as Lindsay alluded to, I get the right button here. Go on. So, let's see if we try plan B. There we go. I've written 3 other books, and I'm not going to go into the background to these, but it was really because of writing these other books that I continued to have this question in my mind as to what was going on in golf in England at the time in which the Gogs was formed in 1901, when Cambridge University Golf Club was formed in 1869, and when Worlington was formed in 1893. And there wasn't a source. Nobody had written down and said, this is how many clubs there were, this is how many golfers were playing golf at this time, this is where all the clubs were. It didn't exist. And so this drew me into thinking, would it be possible to figure that out? And the answer is yes. It just took me 4 years to do it. And the way in which I went about it was essentially drawing on these quite heavy tomes that were published back in the period before the First World War. This is Nisbet's Golf Yearbook 1912. And what it contains is, at the front, is some of the exciting developments in the championships of golf that year, who won the Open, who won the ladies amateur, etc. But the vast majority of the book, 90% of it, is a directory of golf clubs. So it tells you, if I open the page here, maybe not at the Welsh section, let's find another one. Okay, Leamington Golf Club, founded in 1899, 150 members, the station was 2 miles away, and it had 9 holes, the entrance fee was a guinea, and the subs were a guinea, and so forth. You couldn't play on a Sunday, that was the other. So all I had to do was take the information in that book, and in all the other books formed during the period when I was looking at how golf developed in England, and put that into a large database. so that it would then be possible to answer three important questions, I thought. What happened? What was going on? What was the nature of this boom? Where did it happen? Whereabouts in the country was golf taking off? And who were these golfers who were taking to this game? So that was the nub of it. So another go with this one. And whenever I've been speaking to friends I play golf with over the last few years, and they've asked me what I've been working on, I say, well, it was about this great boom that took place in golf in England before the First World War. And the first thing almost everybody says is, oh yes, the railways. And you can see these are cartoons from Golf Illustrated back around about 1900 of nicely dressed gentlemen going to the station, buying the ticket and heading to the coast. And this seems to be a perception that exists to this day, that that's what golf was all about, was getting on trains and going to play golf at the coast. Another perception I think we have is that golf was a rich man's game. It was for the affluent, it was for those who had money and time, and they could play. And you can see from some of these luxurious clubhouses that they had. This is Prince's Golf Club on Mitcham Common in London, which was formed in 1892. And here's the even more glorious Stoke Park, Stoke Poges Golf Club, formed in 1907, and that's where the Goldfinger scene was shot in the 60s. Incredible, elaborate, and clearly not for the common man to be members of these clubs. And then the question of women. Were women important in golf at that time? Or were they just very, very peripheral, not a significant part at all? And here we have a picture from 1873, the ladies of Westward Hall Golf Club, with their rather fine dresses and their putters in their hand, playing on their golf course, which was, I think the longest hole was 50 yards. And they weren't allowed to raise, do it right hand, weren't allowed to raise their arms above shoulder height, because that was considered unladylike. But even if you go, this is Ashdown Forest ladies in 1894, all resplendent in their straw hats and long dresses. I don't think Galvin Green was around at that time, but you can get a sense it might have been quite difficult to play golf in those outfits. So were they just the wives and the daughters of the wealthy men who were playing golf? So we need to start searching for evidence. And as I mentioned, what I did was trawl through these books from the period when golf got going in England through until the First World War and bring all that information together. There was also golf newspapers at that time. Golf Illustrated was created in 1899. We're still going until relatively recently. And just before that, in 1890, there was a newspaper called Golf. It wasn't illustrated, and hence they rebranded it when they started putting photographs in it. But they all exist in the university library, so I'll be able to get access to them. And then there's centenary books, which are quite a useful source of information. Our own by Derek Panicliffe on the Golf on the Gogs. And I was particularly stymied during all the lockdowns over the last few years, because the libraries were closed. I couldn't get access to the information and the sorts of books that I might want to browse through and gather information from. So I decided to create my own library. So I went on eBay and Amazon and picked up lots of copies of club centenaries from all around the country, focusing only on English clubs formed before the First World War. When I scooped up all the cheap ones, I then wrote to all the golf clubs who I hadn't yet got a copy of and begged if they had a copy in the cupboard somewhere that they could send it to me, and I would make a small donation to the captain's charity. Anyway, that brought in another few hundred. I ended up with 500 of them. My office floor is just piles of books, all carefully in piles of the year of formation. So you can look at the floor and it's almost like a histogram. As you can see the flow, ebb and flow of when golf clubs were formed. So I've done my best to put together the data. I think that was the nub of it. Before we dive into England, we've got to put it into context of what was happening in Scotland. The earliest record we've got of golf in Scotland is 1457. the word golf appeared in a Scottish Act of Parliament, banning the playing of golf and football to encourage the yeomen of the country to practice their archery. So it's kind of ironic that we only really know about the existence of golf that early. It's because of the threat of invasion from England. Anyway, 400 years moved on. You'll be pleased to know I'm not doing year-by-year chronology here. And golf in Scotland in the early part of the 19th century was really in the doldrums. There was no railways until about 1840. And there was only 12 golf clubs in Scotland in 1836. And you can see mostly on the east coast or very near the east coast. And they were in a poor state. Combination of the Napoleonic Wars in the early part of the 19th century and then the Industrial Revolution more generally resulted in this great shift away from an agrarian economy towards people working and living in towns. They had less time. Even commons within towns were being encroached upon by the development of housing and factories. And generally, golf and other sports as well were in decline in that period. But then we had the beginning of the boom in Scotland. And the crucial year was 1848. And two things happened. One was the invention of the gutta percha golf ball, replacing the feathery, the one where you stuff the feathers into a leather pouch. They took a good a skilled ball maker could make 6 in a day, featheries. And they cost between 2 and 6 and 4 shillings a ball. And there's a bit of debate about who came up with the idea of using gutta percha, which is just a gum from a tree in Malaysia, where you can put it in water and you can roll it into any shape you want. And golf ball, somebody thought, let's make golf balls out of it. Anyway, it was so easy to do, the materials were cheap, and the price of a golf ball dropped to a shilling. So you had an overnight change in terms of the affordability of playing golf. The other aspect was the railways. So the Glasgow to Edinburgh Railway opened in 1842. By 1846, there was 1 million people going back and forth between Glasgow and Edinburgh each year. And this provided the basis for a network to become established in Scotland. And what you can see here, rather tediously again, I went through all the records of all the railway stations in Scotland and see which year they were opened. So this is from 1835 to about 1890. And you've got this enormous peak here, and the peak year happens to be 1848, when 55 railway stations opened in that one year. So that's evidence that the accessibility to the coast from the major cities was becoming a distinct possibility. So there we have, by 1851, we've got 1,000 miles of railway track in Scotland, and we've even got connections into the English railway system, both on the west and on the east coast. That meant English people going, say, on holiday to Scotland, instead of taking the best part of a week on a stagecoach, could get there in 12 hours between London and Edinburgh. Dramatically changes. What about golf? Well, by 1859, we now had 34 golf clubs in Scotland. And most of them still on the east side of the country, but a few on the west. That's Prestwick over here, and that's Lanark inland here. Vast majority up the east coast, and every one of them had a railway station beside it, with the exception of Peterhead up here, right in the far north. It took till 1863 before they had a railway station. So there you see the consequence of cheaper ball, accessibility via the railways. A boom was beginning to take place in golf. By 1889, there was 170 golf clubs in Scotland. What about England? Okay, 1,000 miles of railway track in Scotland. At the same point in time, 7,500 miles in England. Much more extensive. And it started earlier. Two golf clubs. Do you know what they are?
Up in Manchester.
Correct. Royal Blackheath. 1763. Old Manchester, 1818. Both were formed prior to the railway age. Both were predominantly Scottish expatriates playing golf in England. We're yet to see English people playing golf. So 7,500 miles of railway track, not the same sort of reactions we saw in Scotland. Let's move on. 1869, 10,000 miles of track. 7 golf clubs. We've got 5 more. We're starting to see something happen, but not very much. Blackheath again, Old Manchester. The first genuine English golf club at Westwood Hall, Royal North Devon, in 1864. Then we had London Scottish on Wimbledon Common, 1866. And then we had 3 clubs formed in 1869. Royal Liverpool at Hoylake, Allenmouth up in Northumberland, and this one, Cambridge University Golf Club. One of the first half dozen or so golf clubs in England. Worst golf course ever. Okay, let's move on to 1889 now. Now, in Great Britain, in its entirety, we've got 17,000 miles of track. Today, we've got 11,000. Beach and cuts in the 60s, obviously, a big part of that. Railways everywhere. Just again, I should have mentioned when I showed the slide for 1859. In 1853, every town in England with more than 8,000 people had a railway station. So it penetrated right down to relatively small sized towns. Now we've got golf clubs. We've got 100 in England by 1889. It's still less than there is in Scotland, with a population of 1/6. But nonetheless, golf is beginning to take off. And it's not all at the coast. There's quite a lot of it is inland as well. So the character of the growth of golf in England in these early days is somewhat different from what was happening in Scotland. So that's what the time trend looked like from formation of Royal North Devon in 1864. It was a very, very slow build-up. By the time you get to here, we've still only got 12, 13 clubs by 1880. But then we see things starting to take off towards the end. 1887 here, that's the year when Royal St George's, just St George's in those days, was formed. And that was about the 50th club. So in the next 2 years, we more or less doubled the number. So you're starting to see this tremendous takeoff beginning to happen. But it's not yet the boom. Let's just look at that. So here we are, I've rescaled this. That's the first 25 years of this period. Let's look at the next 25. With that? Yeah. There we are. That's what happened. And that's what took me a year of going through books like this to try and draw that one graph. It was quite an exciting day, I can tell you. So it took 25 years for 100 clubs to form. In the next 25 years, 1,200 clubs were formed. That's nearly one a week for a quarter of a century. You can't call that anything but a boom. And very few of them failed. This is the failures up at the top here. There was only 150 out of that number which didn't make it to the First World War. So I think 12% of the golf clubs in that period failed. And today, of that 1,300 clubs formed prior to the First World War, 780 of them still exist to this day. And they account for approaching half of all the golf clubs in England. So not only was there an enormous boom, these clubs have been incredibly resilient. They still exist, and I'm sure every year you go out and play golf clubs around the country, and you look at the foundation date, and most of them were before the First World War. Okay, so that's the historical flow of what was happening. Let's look at a different dimension, the geography of it, the spread of golf, and how that happened. So, First of all, the different landforms on which golf was played. Golf is played in links land. It's not just in Scotland, but you've got links courses. They're scattered around the English coast also, particularly up here in the northwest. I'm sure many of you played golf between Hoylake and up to Southport, up to Lytham. Loads of golf courses there. And then scattered around other parts of the country. Sort of weak areas are obviously the cliff-lined Yorkshire coast and the estuary areas around the country. But there was about 70 golf clubs formed in England on links land. They all still exist, with the exception of 2 or 3, I think. And only 2 more clubs were formed after the First World War. Any guesses? There are 2 more clubs that were formed on links land since 1914. Trebose and Perranporth, both in Cornwall, formed in the 1920s. No other clubs formed on links land since then. Downland, where we play today. You can see that there was about 50 clubs formed on downland, naturally enough, in the south-eastern part of the country, on the chalk. And here we are, here, the most northerly of the downland clubs formed. That's Royston just below us there. But a lot of them along the south coast. Isle of Wight here had 6 clubs, all on downland at that period. So, an important feature of the boom at that time. And then you had Heathland, again about 50 clubs formed. The great concentration is here, on the Surrey-Berkshire border. The first club formed on those so-called Bagshot sands was Woking in 1893, and then you had clubs like New Zealand, Swingley Forest, Sunningdale, Walton Heath, the list goes on. There was 18 golf clubs formed just in that very small area during the boom. And even on moorland, probably the least satisfactory place to play golf, on the very marshy moorland around the country, down in Dartmoor and then up in the north also. But if you add those 4 up, the links land, downland, heathland and moorland, that only comes to about 200 clubs. So where were the rest? Well, parkland is the answer. Here we have the combination of the other 4, and here are all the clubs that were formed on parkland by 1914. 86% of the clubs formed in that period were on parkland, on pasture, on commons, on parks, grand estates, but they were on basic grassland. 85% of the clubs were inland during the boom. So it wasn't a coastal game as it was in Scotland. And the other thing is that nearly 80% of them started out with 9 holes. Now the reason for that is a combination of factors. First of all, almost everyone in England was a beginner when they took up golf. They didn't come with that sort of traditions coming through families, and you learned as a kid and grew up and took up the game that way. They were all taking it up in midlife. And of course, setting up a golf club is kind of a risky venture. So they tended to have short leases, and 9 holes was cheaper to put together than 18 holes. And they tended to be, as I say, on pasture, very rudimentary courses. They could usually get somebody to come and mark them out one day and to be playing golf within a few weeks. All they had was a hand mower and a roller, and they had sheep and cows, and that was it. That was your green staff. So here's another illustration of the spread of golf. Looking at London. 1889, just before the boom began, there was only 7 golf clubs in London in a population of 5 million. Blackheath, as we know, there's 2 dots there, it's quite hard to see, but that's London Scottish and Wimbledon, Royal Wimbledon, who split. They were 1 club and split into 2. You also had a golf club on Clapham Common and Tooting Common, Tooting Beck, and one up here in the north, that's Royal Epping Forest. So there was only 7 golf clubs in London at that time. I could show you through time how this evolved, but we'll just jump straight to 1914. And that's what golf looked like in London. Over 100 clubs were formed in London in that period. And not just within London itself. Around the outsides, pretty much would be considered to be London clubs. Another 50. So about 150 golf clubs. And you can sort of see, as the suburbs expanded, the golf clubs are moving out along the railway line. As land was being taken over for the development of housing, the golfers had to move further out. But I will add that the railway stations were already there 20 years or so before. So it wasn't as if they were building new settlements and building a railway station and a golf club was opening. Not just London where golf was spreading. So this graph here on the left shows how many golf clubs were in different sizes of town. So the ones at the top here were the 3 cities after London with the population between 500,000 and 1 million, so that was Liverpool, Manchester and Birmingham. And on average they had about 14 clubs each. And you can see there's a very natural pattern. The next down size cities, between 200 and 500,000. Newcastle, Leeds, Sheffield had on average 6 golf clubs. You come down to the bottom and you're looking at towns, Cambridge by the way had about 40,000, population about 40,000 in 1901, to be around about this area. And they had typically 1 club at the bottom end. So quite a regular pattern. We can also look at, of all the clubs that were formed, what proportion were formed in these different sized towns. This is London, by the way, so it was about 9% of the clubs were formed in London. And then these are the other slices of the pie corresponding to the sizes of town on the other side. But you can see what we've got here. Not quite half of the pie explains where all the golf clubs were formed in these sizes of town. And then you've got this. Over half of the golf clubs were formed in towns with populations of less than 10,000. So most golf clubs in England were formed in small market towns, typically inland, typically modest market towns. So we're starting to see evidence that golf was not necessarily just a big city game with affluent golf clubs playing on wonderful heathland. It was penetrating right down to some of the smallest communities in the country. And in fact, if you look at the number of towns between 1,000 and 10,000, 1 in every 3 of those golf clubs, one of every 3 of those towns had a golf club, which is quite remarkable, I think. One of the more interesting findings I thought I'd come up with. Yeah. Now, back to the railways briefly. Show both these. So I looked at the data of all 900 golf clubs and their local railway stations. Again, the book was very helpful and tells me where the railway stations were. And looked at when the station opened and when the golf club opened and figured out how many years there was between the two. And this is shown over here. So very few golf clubs and railway stations opened in the same time period. The vast majority, the stations are there many years before the golf clubs appeared. And here you can see the peak one here was between 40 and 45 years gap in time between the opening of the local station and the creation of the golf course. More information I was able to dig out of the books was how close the railway station was to the golf club. And this shows, again, a histogram here, 200 out of the 900 clubs were within half a mile of the railway station. And if you accumulate these 3 here, that's about 600 clubs, 2/3 of the sample, were within 1.5 miles. The railway station was within 1.5 miles of the golf club. Now, if you remember, of course, the station had been there a long time before the golf club formed. So what this is really saying is that people lived near their golf clubs. And they probably lived closer to their golf clubs than they did to the railway station. They took the railway station to go to work or go elsewhere in the country, but to go to their golf club, it was a much shorter distance. And they wouldn't take the train because they were living closer to the golf club than they were to the station. So, if you're going to the coast, yes, you jumped on the train, but how would you travel to your local golf club? Well, this is the answer. The bicycle. The bicycle, what we call what was called in those days the safety bicycle, as distinct from the penny farthing, which was distinctly unsafe, was invented in the late 1880s. And the pneumatic tyre, Mr. Dunlop, came along in 1888, and that meant we had the bicycle that pretty much we think of today. And the 1890s were known as the golden age of the bicycle. And so there was a huge bicycle boom at the same time as there was a boom in golf. So, and I'm going to show you some of the evidence. Probably the most common form of transport for getting to golf during the boom period, this is before the cars became up and running, was the bicycle, not the train. Here's some bicycles and attachments to attach your golf clubs to. Although I love this advert, it says over here, for carrying rifle and sporting guns, swords, entrenching tools on cycles, also carrier for golf clubs. Swords? Okay, so these were adverts appearing in the golf newspapers. The magazines even about Golfing and Cycling Illustrated. So it used to be called Golf, and they changed its name because they wanted to attract the cyclists in too. This is in Golf Illustrated in 1904. The bicycle boom and the golf boom occurred very much at the same time, and it was the bicycle that made golf popular. Here's a gentleman and a young lady with their bicycles outside of Aldborough Golf Club. On our suburban links, there are almost invariably to be found the cycles, not in ones and twos, but in dozens. Loads of, if I go through all the centenary books, I find constantly examples of bicycle sheds being built and bicycles being stored at golf clubs. Here's one, ours. That's our original clubhouse in 1905. I think we're ahead of time here with having 2 solar panels on the roof. But can you see over here? Maybe you have to get closer. That's a bicycle shed there, with bicycles in it. Just outside the secretary's office, I would say. So we were part of that picture.
And presumably good business for locker room, or locker builders as well.
Oh yeah, they kept their clubs at the clubhouse, unless they were clipping them onto their bicycle. So, picture emerging, golf is spreading around the country, and pretty much everywhere there's a golf club, right down to the smallest communities. So how could that be? And that brings you on to the question, well, how affordable was golf? And this gives you some indication of what was going on in the economy generally at that period. Population was growing very rapidly. Between 1861 and 1911, the population of England grew by 80%. And at the same time, people were becoming better off. And here's an illustration of the point. So this is showing the number of earners, in the country earning at least £150 per annum. The reason why that's an interesting figure is because that's the point when you started paying income tax. 8 pence in the pound, by the way. That's 8 old pennies in the pound. But that gave you an indication of how many people were at least earning, £150. So in 1861 there was about 300,000. By 1910 that number had quadrupled to 1.2 million people were paying taxes by that time. So that looks at the income side of it. How about the cost of golf? So I also gathered information on the cost of equipment and membership costs. So here's how golf balls and woods and irons changed over time. Golf ball, there was the gutta percha ball costing £1. There was a dramatic increase in the price around about 1900 when the Haskell ball was invented. That's the rubber core wound ball, which we were still playing with up until the 1980s perhaps. And that price rose to 2 shillings and then to 2 shillings and 6 was due to shortages of rubber. And nearly for the price of woods and irons. Wouldn't it be lovely today if you could buy a Titleist driver for 3 times the price of a golf ball? Membership costs. So again, going through these old books that are full of information on the same structure as we have today, an entrance fee and an annual subs. So here we are back in 1890 going through to the First World War. Sort of general trend upwards in annual subs from about a guinea, as they used to, everything was in guineas in those days, up to about £3 roughly, and entrance fees showing a similar, slightly, not quite as steep a trend. But this is an average. This is not showing the range that existed. And there were some clubs at the affluent end where it might cost you 20 guineas to join, and you might have to pay 5 guineas a year for your annual subs. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's plenty of examples in there where it was 1 guinea for a year and no joining fee. Typically on these small market town rural clubs. So we have to look at the distribution, not just look at averages. So what I did was trying to combine all this information on the cost of equipment, membership, if you have to pay for a caddy, you have to travel. We still have food and drink after golf, clothing obviously. Trying to bring all of this together, trips to the coast, into a sort of small economic model. And looked at 3 tiers. So an upper tier, a middle tier, and a lower tier in terms of membership costs of joining clubs. So at the upper echelon, you might spend something of the order of £45 to £50 a year. Now that's quite a lot in the context of the threshold for income tax of £150 a year. So this couldn't possibly be people near the bottom end of that spectrum. This was the wealthiest in society who were members of clubs, which would cost you that much. Middle tier was around about £25 a year. Again, you'd probably have to be relatively well off to be spending £25 a year playing golf. But this is probably the most interesting part of the chart here. Between 1890 and 1914, at a fairly large proportion of clubs, golfers could play golf for a year for about £10. Now if you put that into the context of the bottom end of that income tax paying threshold of £150, then you're only looking at about 7% of income. So that's starting to tie together. It's starting to tell us there are golfers who were in the lower middle classes and even in the skilled working classes who could afford, if they wished to play golf. Okay, so there's evidence there, but how many golfers were there? Did it take off? Was it a significant feature of life at that time? So what I did, again, these wonderful books, pick one out. And a club, suitable club here. Hales Owen, members 105. So all I had to do was go through these books and add up all the members of all the golf clubs, men and women. And I had to do some statistical work as well, because they weren't, not everybody was as filled in all the information I needed. Anyway, this is what it looked like when you add it all up. In 1860, there was about 100 golfers in England at the 2 old Scottish clubs. And even in that very slow pick-up period, when there was only 100 clubs formed, there was only about 10,000 men. Sorry, I should say this is referring to men. We'll go on to women in a minute. There was only about 10,000 male golfers in the country. But look what happened during the boom. Incredible acceleration. We already know there was a lot of clubs forming, but the clubs were getting bigger as well. 9-hole courses were being converted to 18-hole courses, and new clubs that were coming in were starting with 18 because there was greater confidence in the Edwardian period that clubs would be successful. So by First World War, you're looking at 220,000 men playing golf in England. And then we have the women. So again, barely any. There was about 1,000 playing golf, 1,000 women playing golf just before the boom began. But 1893 was the crucial moment when the Ladies Golf Union was formed. And E.Z. Pearson reference. She was the key figure. She was the honorary secretary of the LGU, and they set up their first championship 3 months after the formation of the LGU, and the winner was Lady Margaret Scott.
There was Lady Margaret Scott, yes.
Yes.
Before she got married. Yeah.
That's right. Well, she won the first 3 championships and then retired.
Yeah, at the age of 21.
Correct. Correct.
Well, homework.
But this was then seen that women could play this game. Also, remembering the bicycle, this was coming to a period where women could go to the local golf club in groups on bicycles. They didn't have to be chaperoned in the way that they had to before. So this was then, to some extent, part of the emancipation process of women in the late 1890s through into the Edwardian period. And the number of women playing golf increased dramatically. So by just before the First World War, I estimated there was about 75,000 women playing golf. If you add the 2 figures together, you get to about 300,000. So in 1914, 1 in every 4 golfers in England was a woman. Women were not peripheral. They were a part of almost every golf club. Men-only golf clubs were the exception to the rule. Most golf clubs in England were mixed. Particularly the small clubs, the modest clubs in small market towns, they had to have men and women playing. They weren't viable just with men. They needed the income as much as anything. And the women played in midweekdays, and the men played on Saturday afternoons. Most clubs still at that time did not allow golf on a Sunday. So there was, you wouldn't call it equality. There was only one club that really stood out as being equal, and that was Aldborough, where the men and women paid the same fees and they played in the same competitions. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the first female doctor in the country, she was a member of Aldborough. Now, I brought one other book along here, the Ladies Golf Union Yearbook. This is from 1909, and this is a lovely book, because not only does it tell you all the ladies' clubs that year, it tells you the names and addresses of all the ladies playing golf. I just happen to hold open page 313 here, Gog Magog Ladies Golf Club, Cambridge. And you can have a look at this later, but it lists the members. Mrs. Bishop, living at Melville on Hills Road, Cambridge, handicap 24. Pick out another one at random. Miss M. Gaskell, the Uplands, Great Shelford, Cambridge, handicap 27. Mrs. Woodhead, the wife of Jeremy Woodhead, living at Leward Road, Cambridge, handicap 30. So, more information for me to gather. And what I was particularly interested in was the marital status of the women playing golf. So in 1909, I went through that book and I added up all the women playing golf and whether they were married or unmarried. And this here shows there was about 180 clubs. And you can see that the proportion of them who were unmarried versus married. So there were some clubs where there was something of the order of 70% of them were unmarried. And others where there was maybe closer to 70% were married. But the average worked out at pretty much 50% married, 50% unmarried women. Now, of course, there's unmarried women and unmarried women. There's the ones who may be beyond the age of marrying, and then there's the young unmarried women. I couldn't derive what the percentage of those from that book, but by looking at the census data, I could. So the census data breaks down the married and unmarried women by age groups. And what I concluded, assuming that this was a statistically representative sample from the overall population of married and unmarried women, was that 50% were married, 10% were unmarried, but over the, what you might consider over the age of marrying, over 35 in those days. 40%, therefore, were young, unmarried women. That's what golf looked like in those days. And you can see evidence again in the cartoons and jokes that appear in the golf magazines. This is one that was in, I think it was 1909. You can see this young gentleman. Clearly if there's young ladies playing golf at these mixed clubs, there was likely to be young gentlemen too. So it's more like a dating agency in some respects than a golf club. And he's obviously admiring her backswing here. Or something. Anyway, it says down here, hard hit, but it probably would translate to love struck these days. So, what I've tried to do is just give you a flavour of what's in the book. And here's some of the conclusions, just to sort of bring it all together. How are we doing for time? 5 minutes. So, first of all, England didn't follow the blueprint set by Scotland. Golf wasn't predominantly a coastal game, it wasn't predominantly played on linked land, it wasn't played on public land, it was played on private land. The railways were not a significant factor in the boom of golf in England. It was a huge boom, 1 club a week on average for a quarter of a century. It spread everywhere, big cities, very small towns, coastal and inland. There was not one county in England that didn't have golf courses. Most of the golf though was played inland, on parkland, 9-hole courses, on rough pasture, rudimentary courses. Very basic golf, but they got on with it. Didn't complain about bunkers. Small towns accounted for half the clubs. One of the central things coming out of my research, golf was much more affordable than has previously been thought and played by a much broader cross-section. Right down to the skilled working classes. There was 50 artisan clubs in England by 1914. Working class men. I found one working class woman playing golf. She was a dressmaker in Sheffield. That was the only one I could find. And men-only clubs were rare. Most clubs were mixed, and 1 in 4 golfers at that time were women. Today, I think the figure is 15%. It was much more significant then. So I've answered 3, I hope, questions out of my book. What happened in this great boom? Where did it happen? And who were the golfers behind it? There's one question which I've left for those who wish to read the book, and that's why did it happen? Why did it happen at that time? What were the factors that caused this great boom? And if you haven't yet got a copy, I hope I can entice you. That's it. Thank you.